We want to create a complete project in this module where we will go through the entire path I described to you. So we will have a Blazor WebAssembly client, application logic, and a web API through which we can invoke the logic. Because as I mentioned earlier, we cannot invoke server logic directly in the client, only through the web API. We will also have a shared project with models. Our time is limited, so we will create a relatively simple task management application, a standard to-do list application. A simple CRUD where we will implement data creation, display, update, and deletion. We will use the so-called onion architecture here. Onion architecture, as you saw in the previous lesson, is divided into several layers. This means domain, which is our core, our domain entities that know nothing about the other layers. Next is application, which is the application layer where our application logic resides. Application depends on the domain layer but knows nothing about the other layers. Therefore, here we mainly operate on the interfaces of external services. Next, we have infrastructure, which can be said to be external dependencies like the database, file system, SMTP, and other external services. They must be based on interfaces because we expose them to the application through interfaces. And also the presentation layer, which will invoke the application logic. In our case, it will simply be an ASP.NET Core Web API application. Additionally, we will have a client application, which is a Blazor WebAssembly application, and also a shared project, which will have common models for Blazor WebAssembly and the server layer. We will also be using CQRS, but we won't focus on the architecture here, mainly on the Blazor WebAssembly application and the general flow between all the projects. So we'll rely on a setup similar to what I showed you on the slide in previous modules. The application logic will be on the server, but we can't directly reference it from Blazor WebAssembly because the client application would have to download all the code to the browser, which contains various sensitive data, and we don't want that. Instead, the logic will be hidden in the web API. If Blazor WebAssembly wants to execute some logic, whether to run a command or fetch data from the server, it must call the appropriate endpoints in the web API. We will also have a shared project with models, so this slide perfectly represents the project structure we will implement in this and future modules. I hope I have successfully introduced you to this project. It's always worth thinking everything through calmly before implementation, so that you know why we are doing it this way. Now we can move on to the practice and implementation of our application. So, I have launched Visual Studio 2022. We are creating a new project. At the top, in the search bar, please type Blazor. Select the Blazor WebAssembly Standalone App project. Then click Next. The name of our project will be todoapp.client, and that will be the name of the Blazor WebAssembly client. The name of the solution will be Todo App. This way, I will also set the appropriate path here. I click the Next button, and here I choose the .NET 8 version. For me, it is still preview. However, for you, it will be the regular .NET 8 without the preview version, but everything will look the same. Check the configuration for HTTPS. We want to have that checked. And we can also add a few sample pages here. I click Create. Great. So our project has been created. However, we still need a few more projects that I described to you a moment ago. So let's click on Solution. Add New Project. Enter Class Library here and choose Class Library for the C# language. Also, make sure it's .NET and .NET Standard. This is the version of Class Library we are interested in. Next, the project name will be ToDoApp Application, and we create this project. The same .NET 8 version. Great. We add another project. Again, class library. This time it will be domain. Net 8, another project. Class library. TodoApp infrastructure. Next, Net 8, create. And we still need this common project, so it will also be class library. TodoApp, shared. Net 8. And we also need a web API, so add new project. And now you can enter ASP.NET Core and choose the ASP.NET Core Web API template. Next, TodoApp Web API. Next, here we will choose .NET 8. Check HTTPS. Use controllers. Enable Open API support. So we create such a project. Great. We can start by removing these unnecessary classes, so we'll remove class 1 from each project. Great. Next, I'll remove this nullable entry from each project. So if you want everything to work the same way for you as it does for me, also remove this nullable entry from each project. Just double click on the project name, remove the entry, and save the changes. Then we need to add references between these projects. Now, step by step, the application will use the domain and shared projects. Okay, next, the client will only use the shared project. It won't have access to any other projects. This is important. Then we have the domain, but we don't add any references here. For infrastructure, we add a reference to the application. Okay. For shared, we don't add any references, and for web API, we add a reference to infrastructure. Great. This way. Additionally, in the WebAssembly application, it's worth adding the app settings.json file and placing the URL address for the Web API project there. It's beneficial to have this link in the configuration settings because we will refer to it in several places, and this way we can easily change it if needed. We can also quickly switch between different environments. So in the www root folder, click Add New Item. Here you can type in the search bar app settings file. Great. And here we have the app settings JSON. And now we want to add an entry regarding our API. So API configuration : and here we want to have the base address of our web API. To check under which URL address our web API will be running, you need to go to the properties folder and click on the launch settings, just as I mentioned in the web API. So here you see that we have it running on HTTPS. Therefore, you need to find such an entry here. Oh, here is the HTTPS entry, and our web API will be running at this address. However, you need to check what address you have here, because this address will definitely be different. So I copy this address and go back to the app settings file in our client and place this address here. Great, and I save the changes. Another important thing, notice that since we will be calling logic through the web API in Blazor, in order for the Blazor application to work correctly, we always need to run two projects, the Blazor client and the web API server. You need to remember this because without it, you will get an error, and sometimes it may be hard to figure out what's going on. So remember, we now have two different applications, and for the Blazor application to work correctly, both applications must be running. It's worth configuring the solution in such a way that both applications are launched when starting the application, and you can easily set this up in Visual Studio. Just go to the solution, right-click, Properties, and here, check multiple startup projects and select Client, Start Without Debugging, and the same for Web API, Start Without Debugging, then Apply. Okay, and now if I run the application, both projects will be launched simultaneously. So I press Ctrl and F5, and both projects are launched, which means our client and API. Additionally, we can also disable the browser launch for both projects in the launch settings JSON. So previously we went into Web API, Properties, Launch Settings, and disabled the browser launch. Here in the HTTPS entry, set launch browser to false. Do the same for the client in the launch settings for HTTPS, set launch browser to false. Just remember to open the address in the browser manually. Great. And if you now launch the application, for example, by pressing Ctrl and F5, both applications will start. Just remember to open the address in your browser, as I mentioned, because we disabled the automatic browser launch. So now, when you're in the browser, paste that address, and here is our application. Now, I invite you to the next lesson where we will change the screen visible during the application loading.